to change seats. Then learns. She's the CEO's wife. The late afternoon sun streamed through the windows of Gate B17 at O'Hare International Airport, casting long shadows across the terminal floor as passengers lined up for the final boarding call of Flight 2834 to San Francisco. Amelia Martinez adjusted her navy blue uniform collar, her fingers brushing against the silver wings pinned to her lapel, a symbol of authority she'd earned just 6 months ago. At 24, she was one of the youngest flight attendants on the Chicago-based crew, and she took pride in maintaining the airline's high standards. The first-class cabin gleamed under the warm LED lighting, its 12 leather seats arranged in 3 rows of 4. Amelia watched as passengers filtered in, matching faces to seat assignments with practiced efficiency. A distinguished older gentleman in a tailored suit took to AI, immediately donning his noise-canceling headphones. A couple, probably in their 50s, settled into 1C and 1D, their matching wedding bands catching the light as they arranged their belongings. Then Ayanna Johnson appeared at the cabin entrance, and something in Amelia's chest tightened. The woman moved with natural grace, her charcoal gray pantsuit perfectly tailored to her tall frame. Her braids were swept up into an elegant updo, and a delicate gold necklace adorned her neck. She carried a designer laptop bag and a small carry-on that probably cost more than Amelia's monthly salary. Ayanna made her way down the aisle, her heels clicking softly against the floor. She paused at row 2, consulting her boarding pass before sliding into seat 2C. Amelia watched, her brow furrowing slightly. Something didn't feel right. She'd been working this route long enough to recognize the regular first-class passengers, the business executives, and frequent flyers who could afford the premium tickets. Ayanna didn't fit the pattern she'd come to expect. Passengers continued to board, creating a steady stream of movement through the cabin. A businessman nearly dropped his briefcase while attempting to stuff it into the overhead bin, and Amelia stepped forward to assist him. But her attention kept drifting back to 2C, where Ayanna had pulled out a laptop and begun reviewing what appeared to be presentation slides. The mental arithmetic didn't add up in Amelia's mind. Despite Ayanna's obvious sophistication, despite her expensive accessories and professional demeanor, something nagged at her. She'd seen too many passengers try to upgrade themselves, too many people attempt to slip into empty first-class seats. It was her job to maintain order, to ensure everyone was in their proper place. Taking a deep breath, Amelia approached row 2. She painted on her most professional smile, the one she'd practiced in training until it looked natural. "Excuse me, ma'am," she began, her voice pitched low to avoid drawing attention. "I just wanted to verify your seat assignment. Sometimes our system can be a bit confusing, and we wouldn't want you settling into the wrong section." Ayanna looked up from her laptop, her dark eyes meeting Amelia's. There was no surprise in her expression, no guilt or uncertainty, only a calm awareness that suggested she'd encountered similar situations before. Without a word, she reached into her laptop bag and extracted her boarding pass, holding it out with perfectly manicured fingers. Amelia took the document, her cheeks warming slightly as she saw the clear first-class designation, the seat number matching exactly where Ayanna sat. But something still felt off, and 6 months of training had taught her to trust her instincts. "I see," she said, not quite returning the boarding pass yet. "It's just that we've had some issues lately with our booking system. Would you mind if I double-check this against our manifest?" Ayanna's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in her eyes, a mixture of weariness and resolve. "Of course," she replied, her voice carrying the polish of an executive boardroom. "Though I must say, I don't recall any other passengers being asked to verify their seating assignments quite so thoroughly." The comment hung in the air between them, its implications clear but unspoken. Several nearby passengers had begun to take notice of the exchange, their conversations dropping to whispers. A woman in 1B turned in her seat, watching the interaction with poorly concealed interest. "It's just procedure," Amelia insisted, though she could feel her professional demeanor beginning to crack. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable in our main cabin while I sort this out. We have some excellent seats available." I'm quite comfortable here, thank you, Ayana interrupted, her tone remaining even but taking on an edge of steel. As my boarding pass indicates, this is my assigned seat, unless you have a specific reason to believe otherwise. I plan to remain exactly where I am. The tension in the cabin had become palpable. A businessman across the aisle had removed his earbuds, no longer pretending to focus on his phone. Two flight attendants from the main cabin, sensing something amiss, hovered near the galley, exchanging uncertain glances. Amelia felt trapped in a situation rapidly spinning beyond her control. Her training hadn't prepared her for this, for the growing certainty that she'd made a terrible mistake, coupled with the stubborn conviction that she needed to maintain authority. She was aware of every eye on her, of the subtle shift in the cabin's atmosphere from routine pre-flight bustle to uncomfortable spectacle. "Ma'am," she tried again, her voice dropping even lower. "I'm sure we can sort this out quickly. If you'll just—" "I've shown you my boarding pass," Ayana stated firmly, closing her laptop with deliberate care. "I've confirmed my seat assignment. Now, unless you have a valid reason for continuing this discussion, I believe you have other passengers who require your attention." The dismissal was polite but unmistakable. Amelia stood frozen for a moment, caught between pride and protocol, before another passenger's request for assistance gave her an excuse to retreat. She moved down the aisle mechanically, helping stow bags and direct passengers to their seats, but her mind remained fixed on the interaction. More passengers filtered into the first-class cabin, many of them casting curious glances at both Ayana and Amelia. The usual pre-flight routine felt strained, every interaction colored by the lingering tension of the confrontation. Ayana had reopened her laptop, her focus apparently returned to her work, but Amelia noticed the slight tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers moved across the keyboard with perhaps more force than necessary. As the main cabin filled and the flow of boarding passengers slowed to a trickle, Amelia made a decision. She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, and her responsibility to maintain order outweighed her discomfort. With measured steps, she made her way to the front of the plane, where Sandra, the senior flight attendant, was checking the galley supplies. "Sandra," Amelia whispered, her voice tight with suppressed emotion, "I think we might have a situation in first class that requires your attention." She glanced back toward row 2, where Ayana continued to work, seemingly oblivious to the quiet drama unfolding around her. The last few passengers were making their way down the aisle, and soon the boarding door would close. Whatever was going to happen needed to happen quickly. Sandra Moore had been flying for 23 years, and she recognized trouble when she saw it. As she followed Amelia's anxious gaze toward row 2, she took in the scene with practiced efficiency. The elegant passenger focused intently on her laptop, the subtle undercurrent of tension among nearby passengers, and Amelia's barely concealed distress. "I've already checked her boarding pass," Amelia whispered, the words tumbling out in a rush. "But something doesn't feel right. She's being difficult about it." Sandra straightened her shoulders, smoothing down her senior crew uniform. She'd handled countless passenger disputes over the years, and her approach had always been the same: professional, courteous, but unmovable when it came to airline policy. She made her way down the aisle, conscious of how the cabin's atmosphere shifted as she approached row 2. Ayana looked up before Sandra could speak, as if she'd been expecting this escalation. Her expression remained composed, but there was a subtle tightening around her eyes that spoke of growing frustration. "Good evening, ma'am," Sandra began, her tone carrying the weight of authority earned through decades of service. "I understand there might be some confusion about your seating assignment. Would you mind if we took another look at your boarding pass?" Ayana's response was measured, each word carefully chosen. "Actually, I would mind. Your colleague has already verified my documentation, and I've shown considerable patience with what appears to be—" She paused, selecting her next words with diplomatic precision, an unusual level of scrutiny. The last passengers were still boarding, creating a backdrop of shuffling feet and muffled conversations. Among them, A man in a charcoal suit paused briefly at the entrance to first class, his attention caught by the unfolding scene. He remained silent, observing with an intensity that went unnoticed by the flight crew. "I appreciate your cooperation thus far," Sandra continued, maintaining her professional demeanor. "However, as the senior flight attendant, it's my responsibility to ensure all passengers are properly seated before departure. If you could just tell me," Ayana interrupted, her voice low but clear. "Have you made similar requests of other passengers in first class this evening? The gentleman in 2A, perhaps? Or the couple in row 1? The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Several nearby passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and Sandra felt the familiar weight of a situation sliding toward confrontation. Through years of experience, she recognized the subtle signs of a passenger who wouldn't be easily dismissed: the straight spine, the steady gaze, the quiet confidence that suggested this wasn't her first encounter with such treatment. At the front of the cabin, the man in the charcoal suit had settled into the last row of first class, his expression thoughtful as he watched the interaction unfold. His presence went largely unnoticed amid the tension, but his attention never wavered from the scene before him. Sandra took a careful breath, aware that her next words could either diffuse or escalate the situation. "Ma'am, I assure you we conduct random verification checks as part of our standard procedures." "Random?" Ayana's eyebrow arched slightly. "How interesting. I fly this route frequently, Miss Amour," she noted, glancing at Sandra's name tag. "And I've never observed these random checks being performed on other first-class passengers. Perhaps you could explain the selection criteria?" The question was posed with such precise politeness that its challenge was almost subtle, but the implication was clear to everyone within earshot. A few passengers had abandoned any pretense of not listening, their attention fixed on the confrontation playing out before them. Amelia hovered uncertainly near the galley, watching as her senior colleague navigated the increasingly difficult situation. She felt a creeping sense of doubt about her initial decision to question Ayana's presence in first class. The woman's composure and articulate responses were making both flight attendants appear increasingly unprofessional. "Our priority is ensuring all passengers have the most comfortable flight possible," Sandra attempted, falling back on practiced customer service phrases. "If we could just review your documentation one more time." "I believe we've moved beyond documentation," Ayana stated firmly. She closed her laptop again, giving Sandra her full attention. "What we're really discussing is the assumption that led to this repeated questioning of my presence in first class. An assumption that, curiously, hasn't been applied to any other passengers in this cabin." The man in the last row of first class leaned forward slightly, his interest in the exchange becoming more evident. His hand moved toward the call button, then withdrew, as if deciding that direct intervention wasn't yet necessary. Sandra felt the situation slipping further from her control. Her years of experience had taught her to recognize when a passenger had the upper hand, and Ayana's calm dignity combined with her pointed observations had effectively cornered them. The woman clearly belonged in first class. Her demeanor, her articulation, and yes, even her expensive attire all confirmed it. The growing realization that they had possibly engaged in profiling, however unintentional, was becoming uncomfortably clear. The final boarding call echoed through the cabin, adding a sense of urgency to the situation. In a few minutes, they would need to prepare for departure, and this confrontation remained unresolved. Sandra glanced at Amelia, seeing the younger flight attendant's discomfort written plainly on her face. "Perhaps," Ayana suggested, her voice softening slightly, "we could focus on preparing for departure. I'm sure there are other matters requiring your attention, and I'd like to return to my work." She reopened her laptop with deliberate calm, the gesture both a dismissal and a reminder that she had no intention of moving. The cabin fell into an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the sound of the boarding door being sealed and the final preparations for takeoff. Sandra retreated to the galley, where Amelia waited with a mixture of anxiety and embarrassment evident in her expression. "Let it go," Sandra murmured. though the words felt bitter in her mouth. "We have a flight to prepare for." But both women knew that the incident wouldn't truly be forgotten, that it would hang over the service throughout the flight. A reminder of assumptions made and professional boundaries crossed. Near the back of first class, the man in the charcoal suit watched this exchange with an unreadable expression, his fingers drumming thoughtfully on his armrest. As the flight attendants busied themselves with pre-takeoff duties, he pulled out his phone, quickly typing a message before the announcement to switch off all electronic devices. The seatbelt sign chimed as the plane finished its initial ascent, the tension in the first-class cabin having settled into a heavy silence. Ayanna had returned to her work, her fingers moving across her laptop keyboard with practiced efficiency, though anyone watching closely might have noticed the slight tension remaining in her shoulders. The flight attendants moved through their duties with mechanical precision, their interactions with passengers in the first-class cabin notably formal and brief. As the plane leveled off at cruising altitude, the man in the charcoal suit at the back of first class finally stirred from his contemplative observation. Michael Chen, CEO of Skyline Airways, had witnessed enough. He'd been content to watch the scene unfold, gathering a first-hand view of how his flight crew handled sensitive situations. Now, as the seatbelt sign dimmed, he stood with quiet authority. Ayanna glanced up at the movement, and a subtle smile touched her lips. The first genuine expression she'd shown since boarding. Their eyes met in a moment of shared understanding, a silent acknowledgement of the events that had transpired. Michael moved forward, his presence drawing immediate attention from nearby passengers. "Ayanna," he called warmly, his voice carrying easily through the cabin. "I apologize for not greeting you earlier. The board meeting ran longer than expected." He stopped at her row, and she rose to embrace him, the movement elegant and familiar. The effect on the cabin was immediate and electric. Sandra, who had been arranging drinks in the galley, froze in place, recognition dawning on her face. Amelia, passing through with a stack of hot towels, nearly dropped them, her complexion paling visibly. The other passengers, who had been pretending not to watch the unfolding drama, now stared openly. "Michael," Ayanna responded, her voice carrying a hint of amusement. "I was wondering when you'd make your presence known." She gestured to her laptop screen. "I've been reviewing the quarterly projections you sent over. We should discuss the Asian market expansion over dinner." The casual exchange of business talk between them carried more weight than any formal introduction could have. Here was Ayanna, the woman who had been repeatedly questioned about her presence in first class, discussing corporate strategy with the airline's CEO as an equal. Michael's hand rested briefly on the back of Ayanna's seat as he leaned in to glance at her laptop screen. "I see you've already noted the discrepancy in the Hong Kong numbers," he commented, then straightened up, his attention shifting to the flight attendants who stood frozen in their duties. Sandra recovered first, her years of experience helping her mask her shock behind a professional veneer. "Mr. Chen," she acknowledged, her voice carefully controlled. "We weren't aware you'd be joining us today." The unspoken question hung in the air. Why hadn't he intervened earlier? "I prefer to observe our operations firsthand occasionally," Michael replied, his tone pleasant but carrying an unmistakable edge. "It provides valuable insights into our customer service." His eyes met Sandra's, then Amelia's, the message clear without being stated explicitly. Amelia clutched the towels closer to her chest, feeling as though the floor had dropped out from beneath her feet. The woman she had so confidently questioned, had tried to redirect to coach, was not only supposed to be in first class, but was apparently on close terms with the CEO himself. "Ayanna Johnson heads our corporate strategy division," Michael continued, his voice pitched to carry just far enough for nearby passengers to hear. "She's been instrumental in our expansion plans for the past 5 years." Each word fell like a gentle hammer, dismantling any lingering doubts about Ayanna's legitimacy in first class. The other passengers shifted in their seats, some looking away in embarrassment, others watching with undisguised interest. The couple in row 1 exchanged knowing glances, while the businessman who had earlier removed his earbuds to listen to the confrontation suddenly became very interested in his phone. Ayanna maintained her composure, her expression revealing nothing of her thoughts as she watched the recognition ripple through the cabin. She had handled the entire situation with dignity, never once pulling rank or revealing her position to force respect. The contrast between her behavior and the assumptions made about her hung heavy in the air. "The Bangkok projections look promising," she said to Michael, smoothly steering the conversation back to business. But there was a subtle emphasis in her voice, a quiet assertion of her professional status that needed no further elaboration. She belonged in this cabin, in this conversation, in this role, regardless of anyone's preconceptions. Michael nodded, understanding her tacit handling of the situation. "We should discuss them in detail. I have some thoughts about the timeline." He settled into the empty seat beside her, their conversation shifting to the comfortable rhythm of longtime colleagues. The flight attendants retreated to the galley, their movements stiff with the awareness of their mistake. Sandra began preparing the drink service with mechanical precision, while Amelia stood slightly apart, her face still frozen in an expression of mortification. The gravity of their error, not just a mistake in customer service, but a display of prejudice against a senior executive, seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. Throughout the cabin, passengers adjusted their behavior subtly but noticeably. Those who had watched the earlier confrontation with passive interest or barely concealed judgment now seemed eager to demonstrate their own sophistication and lack of bias. The businessman across the aisle made a point of nodding respectfully in Ayanna's direction, while the couple in row 1 spoke in hushed, disapproving tones about unprofessional behavior. The transformation was both subtle and profound, a shift in the cabin's atmosphere that highlighted how quickly assumptions could be reversed when status and authority were made explicit. Yet this very transformation served to underscore the problematic nature of the initial treatment, raising uncomfortable questions about why such validation had been necessary in the first place. As the flight progressed over the Midwest, Amelia moved through her duties in a daze, her movements automatic while her mind replayed the earlier confrontation in an endless loop. Each time she passed row 2, where Ayanna and Michael continued their quiet discussion over laptops and spreadsheets, she felt a fresh wave of shame wash over her. The drink service had become an exercise in humility, her hands trembling slightly as she served Ayanna her requested sparkling water with lime. In the galley, between services, Amelia caught her reflection in the metallic surface of a coffee pot. The face that stared back at her seemed different somehow, as if the events of the past hour had physically altered her features. She found herself examining her own thoughts with uncomfortable clarity, wondering how many other times she had made similar assumptions without being confronted with such clear evidence of her error. The turbulence alert chimed, a brief reminder of their passage through a weather system over Nebraska. As Amelia moved through the cabin ensuring seatbelts were fastened, she noticed how Ayanna handled the bumpy air with the same composure she'd shown during their confrontation. She maintained her focus on her work, occasionally pausing to make a point to Michael, her movements economical and assured even as the plane dipped and swayed. Michael watched Amelia's internal struggle with the quiet attention of someone used to reading people. He leaned closer to Ayanna, speaking in low tones that nonetheless carried to nearby seats. "Your handling of the situation was exemplary," he murmured, "though I wish it hadn't been necessary." Ayanna's fingers paused over her keyboard, her expression thoughtful. "It's not the first time," she replied, her voice equally measured. "And unfortunately, it won't be the last. But each encounter is an opportunity for awareness. Wouldn't you agree?" The plane encountered another patch of rough air, and Michael waited for it to pass before responding. "True. Though I find myself wondering about the cost of these opportunities, the constant need to prove oneself, to maintain composure in the face of assumptions." Sandra, passing by with a fresh pot of coffee, couldn't help but overhear their conversation. Her own discomfort had evolved into something more complex, a mixture of professional embarrassment and personal revelation. She'd prided herself on her years of experience, her ability to handle any situation with grace, yet today had exposed blind spots she hadn't wanted to acknowledge. In the main cabin, beyond the curtain that separated the classes, life continued as normal. But in first class, the atmosphere remained charged with unspoken tensions and revelations. The businessman who had witnessed the entire scene was now ostentatiously reading a book about corporate diversity, its cover clearly visible. The couple in row 1 had fallen into an intense, whispered discussion about their own company's hiring practices. Ayanna observed it all with quiet awareness, her expression revealing nothing of her thoughts. Yet when she spoke again to Michael, her words carried the weight of long experience. "What interests me most?" she mused. Saving her work and closing her laptop, here is not the initial assumption. That's sadly predictable. It's the resistance to correction, the need to double down even when presented with evidence that contradicts the assumption. Michael nodded, understanding flooding his features. "The escalation," he agreed. "The call for backup, the suggestion that you move to coach even after seeing your boarding pass." As if it was easier to believe there was some mistake than to question the underlying assumption. Their conversation, though quiet, carried just far enough for Amelia to catch fragments as she restocked the galley. Each word seemed to pierce her defenses, forcing her to confront her own actions with increasing clarity. She remembered her certainty, her instant doubt upon seeing Ayanna in first class. How had she been so confident in her judgment? What had made her trust her instincts over the clear evidence of a valid boarding pass? The flight path carried them over the Rockies, the plane banking slightly to navigate around a gathering storm system. Through the windows, the late afternoon sun painted the clouds in shades of gold and purple, creating a dramatic backdrop for the scene playing out in the cabin. Ayanna gazed out at the magnificent view, her reflection overlaid against the clouds. And for a moment she allowed her professional mask to slip slightly. "You know," she said to Michael, though her eyes remained on the horizon, "every time this happens, there's a part of me that wants to react differently, to let the anger show, to demand immediate recognition of the prejudice at play. But that would only reinforce their preconceptions, wouldn't it? So instead, we maintain our composure. We stay professional. We prove ourselves over and over." Michael's expression darkened slightly. "It shouldn't be necessary," he stated, his voice carrying an edge of frustration. "Excellence shouldn't require constant proof, constant validation." Their words drifted back to where Amelia stood, frozen in the act of arranging glasses on her service cart. Each statement hit home with devastating accuracy, forcing her to examine her own role in perpetuating these patterns. She thought about how quickly she'd jumped to conclusions, how easily she'd dismissed Ayanna's valid documentation, how readily she'd escalated the situation rather than questioning her own assumptions. The plane continued its journey westward, carrying its passengers through physical space while some, like Amelia, found themselves traveling through more personal territory, examining beliefs they'd held unquestioned, confronting biases they'd preferred not to acknowledge. The routine announcements about arrival time and weather conditions seemed trivial now, background noise to the more significant transformations taking place in the minds and hearts of those who had witnessed or participated in the day's events. The plane had reached its cruising altitude over Nevada when Michael pressed the call button, the soft chime cutting through the cabin's quiet hum. Amelia's heart skipped a beat as she saw the illuminated light. She glanced at Sandra, who gave her a slight nod. This was her situation to handle, her lesson to learn. With measured steps that belied her internal turmoil, Amelia approached row 2. The setting sun streaming through the windows cast long shadows across the cabin, lending an almost theatrical quality to the scene. "Yes, Mr. Chen," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. Michael smiled, but his eyes held a serious expression. "Amelia, would you mind joining us for a moment? I believe we have something to discuss." He gestured to the empty seat across the aisle, recently vacated by a passenger who had moved to the lavatory. Ayanna closed her laptop again, her movements deliberate and unhurried. The nearby passengers, who had been stealing glances throughout the flight, now watched with undisguised interest, though they pretended to be absorbed in their books or tablets. Amelia hesitated, then sat down, her uniform suddenly feeling too tight, too formal, like armor that offered no real protection. "Of course, sir. Please, call me Michael," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "I'd like to talk about what happened during boarding. Do you remember your exact thought process when you first approached Ms. Johnson?" The question hung in the air, direct but not accusatory. Amelia felt the weight of multiple gazes upon her, Michael's patient attention, Ayanna's composed observation, and the furtive glances of other passengers. The usual background noise of the aircraft seemed to fade away, leaving a bubble of intense focus around their conversation. "I thought," she began, then stopped, struggling to articulate thoughts she was only now beginning to fully understand. "I saw Ms. Johnson, and something didn't feel right to me. I relied on what I thought was instinct, but now I realize it wasn't instinct at all. It was bias," Ayanna supplied quietly, completing the thought Amelia couldn't quite voice. "Unconscious, perhaps, but bias nonetheless." The words settled between them like a physical presence. Amelia felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes, but she forced herself to maintain composure. Professional training ran deep, even in moments of personal crisis. "Yes," she acknowledged, her voice barely above a whisper. "I made assumptions based on... I didn't even question why I was questioning you. Even when you showed me your boarding pass, I couldn't let go of my initial judgment. I kept looking for ways to prove I was right instead of considering that I might be wrong." Michael nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "That's an important recognition, Amelia. But I'd like to hear from Ms. Johnson now, if she's willing to share her perspective on the experience." Ayanna straightened slightly in her seat, her poise remarkable given the circumstances. When she spoke, her voice carried no anger, only a measured certainty that made her words all the more impactful. "What struck me most," she began, "wasn't the initial questioning. As I mentioned to Michael earlier, that's unfortunately common enough. What affected me was the escalation, the refusal to accept the evidence before you, the suggestion that I move to coach even after verifying my ticket, the call for a senior flight attendant. Each step revealed not just bias, but a deep-seated resistance to having that bias challenged." The sunlight through the window had shifted, painting Ayanna's face in warm golden tones that seemed to emphasize the dignity of her bearing. "Every time this happens," she continued, "I have a choice to make. I can react with anger, which would only reinforce stereotypes about angry Black women. I can back down, which would solve the immediate problem but solve nothing in the long term. Or I can maintain my composure and hope that the experience becomes a teaching moment." Amelia felt each word like a physical impact. "I'm so sorry," she said, the words catching in her throat. "Not just for what I did, but for putting you in that position at all, for making you responsible for teaching me through your dignity rather than doing the work myself to examine my own assumptions." A flight attendant from economy class passed through, pausing briefly at the sight of their intense conversation before continuing on her way. The moment served as a reminder that they were having this deeply personal exchange in a very public space. Yet somehow that seemed fitting. Prejudice hadn't been private. Why should the acknowledgement of it be? "You know," Michael interjected softly, "one of the reasons I didn't intervene immediately was because I wanted to see how the situation would unfold naturally. Not to test you, Amelia, but to understand firsthand what our passengers might experience. What I witnessed was troubling, but this conversation gives me hope." Ayanna nodded in agreement. "Recognition is the first step," she said. "Many people, when confronted with their biases, become defensive. They try to justify their actions or dismiss the impact. You're sitting here, having this difficult conversation, really listening and attempting to understand. That matters." The overhead speakers crackled with a weather update from the cockpit. a mundane interruption that seemed almost surreal against the gravity of their discussion. Amelia used the moment to compose herself, to gather her thoughts. "I want to do better," she said finally, her voice stronger now. "Not just offer words, but really understand and change. I keep thinking about how many times I might have done this before, made assumptions without even being conscious of them. How many passengers I might have made feel unwelcome or questioned without justification." "That awareness," Ayana replied, "is valuable, but it's what you do with it that matters most. How will this experience change your interactions with future passengers? What will you do differently the next time your instincts tell you something isn't right?" The questions weren't rhetorical, and Amelia took a moment to consider them seriously. Around them, the cabin had grown quieter, as if the other passengers were also reflecting on these questions in their own ways. "I'll stop and question those instincts," she said slowly, working through her thoughts. "Ask myself what's really driving my suspicions. Look for evidence that challenges my assumptions rather than just evidence that confirms them. And maybe most importantly, remember this conversation. Remember how it feels to confront these uncomfortable truths about myself." Michael and Ayana exchanged a glance, a look that spoke of shared experiences and understanding. The sun had dipped lower on the horizon, casting the cabin in softer light, but illuminating the truth of the moment with stark clarity. As the flight entered its final hour, the atmosphere in first class had transformed into something markedly different from the tense environment of takeoff. Amelia moved through the cabin with a new awareness, each interaction weighted with conscious intention. When she served Ayana and Michael their pre-landing beverages, her movements were deliberate, respectful without being obsequious. The ice in Ayana's sparkling water clinked softly as she accepted the glass, her quiet "thank you" carrying none of the earlier tension. Michael observed the exchange with approval, noting how Amelia had begun to adjust her demeanor not just toward them, but toward all passengers. Each interaction now seemed measured, thoughtful, free from the unconscious prejudgments that had earlier clouded her perspective. Other passengers had picked up on the shift as well. The businessman who had witnessed the entire drama now made a point of treating Amelia with particular kindness, as if acknowledging that growth and learning deserved support rather than condemnation. The couple in row 1, who had been whispering disapprovingly earlier, now watched the transformed dynamic with thoughtful expressions. Sandra passed through occasionally, her experienced eyes taking in the changed atmosphere. She'd been in aviation long enough to recognize pivotal moments, and this flight had become one, a turning point not just for Amelia, but potentially for their entire crew's approach to passenger interactions. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in deep purples and blues, Michael engaged in casual conversation with nearby passengers. His words were carefully chosen, each interaction subtly reinforcing the lessons of the day without explicitly referencing the earlier conflict. "You know," he mentioned to the businessman across the aisle, loud enough for others to hear, "one of the things I'm proudest of at Skyline is our diverse executive team. People like Ms. Johnson here have been instrumental in our global expansion." The cabin lights dimmed slightly as they began their descent into San Francisco, the city lights below twinkling like earthbound stars. Ayana had packed away her laptop, now sitting in quiet contemplation as the plane gradually lost altitude. The testing moment came when Amelia approached for the final check of seat belts and tray tables. "Ms. Johnson," Amelia said, her voice carrying a new note of genuine respect, "is there anything you need before we land?" Ayana looked up, meeting Amelia's eyes directly. The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken understanding. "No, thank you," she replied simply, but her tone conveyed more than the words themselves, an acknowledgement of change, of lessons learned and growth initiated. The plane banked gently, beginning its final approach into San Francisco International. Through the windows, the city's iconic skyline emerged from the darkness, a glittering testament to human achievement and potential. In the cabin, Michael observed as Amelia completed her final duties, noting how she now moved with a different kind of confidence, not the brittle authority of earlier, but something more genuine, more thoughtful. Other crew members had noticed the change as well. The flight attendant from economy who had passed through earlier now worked alongside Amelia in preparing for landing, picking up on her altered demeanor and adjusting her own accordingly. It was as if the lesson of the day had begun to ripple outward, touching everyone who had witnessed or participated in the events. "Cabin crew, please prepare for landing," the captain's voice announced over the intercom, a routine command that seemed to carry extra weight tonight. As Amelia secured the galley and returned to her jump seat, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the darkened window. The face that looked back at her seemed different from the one that had started this journey. Older, perhaps, but also wiser, more aware. The landing gear deployed with a familiar thud, and the plane began its final descent. In row 2, Ayanna and Michael exchanged quiet words, their conversation inaudible over the sound of the engines, but their expressions suggesting satisfaction with how the day's events had unfolded. The touchdown was smooth, the plane settling onto the runway with barely a bump. As they taxied to the gate, the cabin remained unusually quiet, as if the passengers were still processing the day's events. The usual rush to retrieve phones and stand up before the seatbelt sign was turned off seemed subdued, replaced by a more thoughtful atmosphere. When the aircraft finally came to a stop at the gate, Michael stood first, gathering his belongings with unhurried movements. He turned to Ayanna, who rose with her characteristic grace, collecting her laptop bag and carry-on with efficient movements. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to San Francisco International Airport." Amelia's voice came over the intercom, steady and clear. Local time is 7:45 p.m., and the temperature is a pleasant 65 degrees. On behalf of Captain Stevens and the entire crew, thank you for flying with Skyline Airways. As passengers began to deplane, the interactions between crew and customers carried a different quality than usual. There was more eye contact, more genuine acknowledgement, as if everyone had been reminded of the humanity behind their respective roles. Amelia stood at the front of the aircraft, thanking passengers as they deplaned. When Ayanna and Michael reached the door, there was a moment of pause. The words, "Thank you for flying with us," seemed inadequate